I am recording now. Okay, well, hello everyone. Happy Wednesday. Welcome back to ECON 181. Are there any questions or comments before we start today? Anything? Complaints? Questions? Comments? Digital apples for the professor? I take them all. All right. So I don't see anybody. So let me do this. I'm going to start sharing my screen, guys. Today, we are going to continue talking about ISI, import substitution industrialization. So as you probably remember or have seen in recorded classes, the world in the 1930s was at this juncture because of the Great Depression that required a reformulation of economic development strategies. And at the same time, we have seen that dependency theory was advancing all these arguments from the poor countries' side, from the poor countries' point of view, that argue that one way to minimize the negative influence of rich countries was to retract, was to withdraw from international economic affairs. Similar arguments were advanced by structuralists, the ECLA approach. And, in the 1940s, 1950s, the 1960s, this became known, this set of policies, not just the theory, not just the ideas or hypotheses, but the actual policies became known as ISI, import substitution industrialization. So the idea, and I really want to make the case for the ISI, because as you will see, it was very successful for a while until things went wrong. And we are going to discover this in the next few classes. But this is what the general strategy was about, at least in Latin America, and at some extent in a very similar fashion in East Asian economies. I'm talking about countries like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and the so-called tigers or dragons of Asia. But anyway, in Latin America, policymakers said, all right, guys, what we need to do is to figure out the best set of policies and strategies to promote economic growth from within. Internal machines and strategies to grow. We want to diminish our dependence from international markets, from rich nations, right? So the goal, the basic goal with this strategy was to produce, and I'm here, to produce substitutes for expensive imports. So think about the following way. Latin America was buying machines, equipment, manufactured goods. I'm talking about clothes. I'm talking about, let me admit these people that I had forgot to admit. Latin America was buying all these expensive things from rich countries. And then they said, we don't have to do this. What about if we figure out the technology, the know-how? All we need to do is to develop the technology and the know-how internally, so that instead of buying all these bicycles and all these cars and all these medical equipment, construction equipment from overseas, we produce it here, right? So this is what they thought as the process of industrialization. And of course, technology, investment in technological improvements was put at the center of this development process. And as I mentioned on Monday, they saw as the only entity, the only economic agent capable to orchestrate, to organize, to shape this development strategy was the state. the federal government in coordination with the state and local governments, of course. Particularly because this strategy requires a very high level of coordination in terms of policymaking across especially large countries like Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. In smaller countries like Nicaragua or Costa Rica, it wasn't a big deal. But for large economies, you need a massive amount of communication and coordination. And another reason was that, well, this process was going to require a massive infusion, a large injection of capital for it to work, right? So the government was the only entity. There was no entrepreneurial class. There was no people with the capital, or even if there were some rich folks in Latin America, they were not going to invest in what it was needed for the strategy, right? So here I want to make two interesting points, and this is part of where economics overlaps with politics, not political economy, but with politics, right? So if you have a basic understanding of history, at some extent economic history in Latin America, and I briefly mentioned this already, you are going to realize that in the 1950s and 60s especially, and at some extent the 70s as well, Latin America was characterized by a dominance, I'm talking about the political arena, by the dominance of populist policies. So in Cuba, you had Fidel Castro. In Argentina, you had Juan Perón. You probably have seen that movie with Madonna, Evita. Evita is essentially Eva Perón, the wife of Juan Perón. Getulio Vargas in Brazil, and many other people in Latin America that ran in these very populist platforms because they were all, trying to appeal to the masses in this very paternalistic approach, telling them, don't worry, we are going to attend your needs. We know that you are, requiring jobs, higher incomes. We need to, minimize poverty. We need to recalibrate, distribution of income and wealth. And of course they won. But in order to do that, they need big governments, big government apparatuses, big government structures. And guess what? This was fully in line with what import substitution industrialization required. Big government, right? Protectionism, cutting ties with international, actors, the bad guys, the people exploiting poor countries. So all these guys had a lot of tools to look and appear very appealing, running on these political platforms, and that's how they won democratically elected governments, right? And then the second comment is that, well, I'm talking about this one right here. These guys were also very smart in the following sense. So let me give you some intuition first, and then I am going to tie back to this idea. So if you have an idea as an entrepreneur for a business, you want to create a business, you go to the bank and say, hey, Mr. Banker, I want to borrow money from you. Okay, what do you need the money for? Well, I need to open a business. I need to make money. But okay, show me your business plan. So you present your business plan. They run this risk assessment, plan to check if your business plan makes sense, whatever, right? So they say yes or no, or yes, we're going to charge you this interest rate, whatever, right? So that's how the process of growth in terms of business takes place. Well, in terms of Latin America and the ISI strategy, what Latin American governments at the time did was, okay, where are we going to get this money from, right? So one key element during this time was to present the ISI strategy as the business plan to the international banking community. So I'm talking about not just domestic banks in Latin America, but international banks, including some private banks like, well, at the time, JP Morgan, Chase, and other major international banks in England, in Japan, and other European banks, but also the IMF and the World Bank. And at the time, one of the key elements to give credibility to this ISI business plan was that they were the collateral, because that's when, in banking terms, for example, when you buy a house or when you buy a car, the collateral is the house itself or the car itself. If you don't pay back to the bank, well, the bank is going to repossess your house, repossess your car, and you are done, right? But in the case of countries, you cannot present your country as collateral. The international bank cannot take over your entire country, right? They cannot do that. Well, with a few exceptions, but when essentially as a matter of foreign policy, the US has actually taken over countries. But anyway, in the case of Latin America at the time, what they did was, okay, the collateral is going to be the vast amount of raw materials that we have. What do you mean? Well, in Mexico, they said we have tons of oil, like in Venezuela. In Bolivia, we have tons of gas. And every country basically had, in Chile, copper, meat, beef, all of these things. They presented these things as collateral. And guess what? They were able to convince the international financial community that the ISI strategy as a business plan made sense. And they start funneling, they start channeling resources to Latin America. Right? Some of that was as a loan, and some of that was as in the form of FDI, foreign direct investment, right? So multinational corporations investing in this country, in this region of the world. Anyway, one problem that we are going to examine later is that, these populist leaders in Latin America saw this as a great opportunity to enhance power, to keep, to keep looking appealing to the masses and all that. And they start engaging in policies that were not necessarily very healthy, as we will discover later. As a consequence, they start running into fiscal deficits, balance of payments problems, inflation, and many other problems that we are going to explore in the next few classes until, as we will see, this became a crisis that we have never seen up to 1982, right? So right now we're in the 60s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. We are not in the 80s yet, right? But we will get there. Anyway, ECLA obviously was of significant influence because, especially because of this argument. ECLA, in addition to argue that, okay, we need to move away from producing raw materials and crops and fisheries and mining. We need to, diversify and get to manufacturing and services. In addition to that, which was clear, they also said, in Latin America, we don't have a strong capitalist entrepreneurial class. We need to develop one. And in order to do that, we need to protect Latin America so that all these entrepreneurial, all these infant industries can, be born, grow, develop, mature. And once they are ready to compete internationally, we dismantle the protection and go out to compete in the big leagues. It's a very strong argument when you think about it, because, remember, all throughout the 19th century, which was a waste of time, nothing happened, right? And then at the beginning of the 19th century, or the 20th century, you have this major Great Depression. And anyway, the point is that Latin America didn't have a strong, capable, entrepreneurial class, not just in terms of managerial, accounting, economics, knowledge, but also the high concentration of income put all this wealth in very few hands rather than diversify throughout the countries, throughout the regions within the countries, across industries, nothing like that, right? So anyway, ECLA, along with all these policies, now think about this. All these populist governments, that normally don't have the backup system of multilateral agencies, at the time enjoy that, because ECLAC, remember, is a very important branch of the UN, the United Nations. So think about this. You are Fidel Castro, or you are Getulio Vargas in Brazil, or you are whoever, any populist government in the 50s and the 60s, and then you can always quote, well, we are following the prescription of the United Nations experts. Like, whoa, I mean, what else do you want, right? This sounds pretty appealing when you don't know better, right? Anyway, so ECLAC and these UN experts had this two-prong approach. The international part, okay. They said, in addition to craft these domestic policies in each country, ISI policies, we are going to try to organize Latin America to create a common front against European interest, American interest, Asian interest. So the idea since the 1940s and 1950s was to integrate Latin America. In that sense, obviously the Europeans are way ahead of Latin America, years ahead of Latin America, and probably decades ahead of Africa. So Europe, I'm talking about the European Union now, obviously things are breaking apart because now the UK is off. But anyway, the continental Europe is what we would consider a bloc of countries unified. Well, this was the vision of ECLA 80 years ago. Of course, didn't pan out. It hasn't worked for reasons that we are going to explore later. But the point I'm trying to make is that this idea that the Europeans had about integration was not new. This has been in the making for many, many, many years in other regions in the world. Unfortunately, it didn't work very well for Latin America. It seemed to be working relatively well for Europe, but now things are, breaking apart. We'll see what happens. But anyway, and of course, the national approach, which we already talk about, producing internally rather than importing, right? ECLA actually had a master plan that you can read here, stages where they were going to increase the complexity based on the development of technology. They were going to start with basic non-durable goods like textiles, foodstuffs, and they're going to move to cars, TVs. And the idea was to, at different, paces in different countries, but always moving forward and upward in terms of technology, in terms of, developing their own native know-how, right? So the plan was great. The plan was fantastic, right? And these were some of the tools. So let me stop here. Okay, let me stop here for a second. Questions, comments so far?
Just real quick, Professor, I wanted to know, Latin America, the economy it's pretty much still agriculture heavy, right?
Not today. I mean, there is a significant reliance on agriculture, yes, relative to certainly rich economies, but there are places like, say, Mexico, where manufacturing is huge. Most of the cars that we drive in the US were produced in Mexico, or, in places like Brazil. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Brazil is building airplanes. Some of the airplanes that we fly on in the US were built in Brazil. Brazil has a seat in the space station, right? So not all Latin American countries are so behind. There are some countries that are moving faster forward. But of course, if you think about places like Nicaragua, yeah, they are getting behind. Haiti, yes, very, very behind.
There's a Boeing plant in Brazil or
No, no, no. I cannot remember the brand name. No, no, no. But Brazil has its own brand. It's not Boeing. It's not Airbus. It's a Brazilian brand name. Of course, these planes are not the big planes. They are smaller planes like jets and I don't know 40, 50 people, not the 300-400 people that you're thinking about. Yeah, right.
Is it like Aero Mexico?
No, wait a second. So we need to make a distinction between the airlines and the airplane manufacturers. So Aeromexico buys Boeing and Airbus planes so that they can, provide the service. But Mexico doesn't produce their own planes. No. Does that make sense,
Okay.
Stephen?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Good question, though. That was a good question. But no, I mean, there is this distinction that is very important. Originally, during the ISI strategy, that was the point. Rather than buying planes from Boeing or Airbus in Europe, Brazil was one of the successful countries that they were able to develop their own technology to produce Brazilian airplanes. Not big ones, not very successful, because as you know, worldwide, there are only two big plane makers, Boeing and Airbus. But at least they were able to develop their own smaller type of plane that they can call 100% Brazilian. Yeah.
When it comes to vehicle manufacturing in Mexico, they don't have like their own brand, right? It's like other countries putting their own manufacturing plants, right?
That is correct. That is correct. And the reason many manufacturing plants, car automakers are located in Mexico is because they are taking advantage of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So there is something called rules of origin. So if the car has a minimum component of being produced within Mexico, Canada, or the US, it can enter to the US in a cheaper way than if it wasn't, right? So all the labor, especially that is put into it could be a BMW, could be a Toyota, could be a Chevy car. All this Mexican labor increases the percentage of the Mexican share in the manufacturing of this car, and that allows them to sell to the American public, which is one of the largest markets in the world. So, I mean, that's one of the benefits of being neighbors of the U.S. Mm-hmm.
And the transportation costs are probably low too, along with the.
Oh, that's a good point. Transportation costs too. Yep. Anyway, what I want to do here, let me share my screen very quickly. But now let's go with the whiteboard. All right. So let me see. This is Latin America, all the way from Mexico in the north to Argentina and Chile in the south, right? So this is Latin America. And this is the rest of the world, ROW, right? So ROW includes Europe, Canada, the US, and whatever, right? So with no protection, you see the rest of the world selling cars, bicycles, refrigerators, all the things that rich countries produce to Latin American countries. But then Latin America says, well, let's stop this. We are going to produce this protective bubble. In red is supposed to be a bubble of protection. So that now, let's say if you have a bicycle, here is my bicycle, trying to, it could be, I don't know, whatever brand name you want from Europe or the US to Mexico or any Latin American country, then they are going to face this protective bubble. Now, what is this protective bubble composed of? Well, I'm talking about tariffs and quotas, mainly. So this was the idea. So let's suppose that in Mexico, the same or a similar bicycle cost, I'm totally making this up so that you get the idea. Let's suppose that this bicycle in Mexico is $100. and the European bike only cost $50. With no protection, obviously, a domestic Mexican rider is going to prefer the $50 European bike over the $100 Mexican bike. Obviously, right? Just because of price. Let's assume that the bikes are the same. But then the Mexican government in the 1950s and 60s, they say, all right, let's implement import substitution industrialization. What does that mean? We are going to impose a tariff. So let's suppose that the tariff is 100% tax. So if the European bicycle maker wants to sell the bike in Mexico, the Mexican consumer has to pay $50 to the Europeans plus another $50, 100% more, to the Mexican government. And then the European bike is going to cost the same as the Mexican bike. So they are going to compete in terms of quality or whatever. But then they say, no, let's go even further. Let's increase this to, I don't know, 120%. Or let's put this crazy, 200% tax, which is the tariff. Well, guess what? Now the European bike is going to cost $150. Obviously, the domestic Mexican consumer is going to buy the domestically produced Mexican bike. You understand how through this mechanism, through policies, the government can direct consumption away from international stuff, away from imports, towards domestic consumption. Now, you're thinking about bikes, one, but think about millions of bikes. Well, guess what? That's how we are going to promote a domestic industry to produce domestic bikes. And the same with refrigerators, and the same with cars, and the same with planes, and the same with everything that we are buying from overseas right now. Or, quotas. The government may say, okay, guys, we are going to let you buy European bikes, but only 1 million. After 1 million, no more European bikes. You have to buy from domestic Mexican companies. You get the idea, right? So let me stop sharing here. So the basic idea, guys, and let me now go back to my PowerPoint or whatever, hold on, I'm doing this wrong. Sorry. This is what I want to go. Share screen. Okay. So this is what I want to highlight here. The basic tools of protectionism, the creation of this protected bubble, consist of mainly quotas and tariffs, right? But there are other elements like export subsidies, foreign exchange controls. This is a bit more complicated to explain, especially for those of you that don't have a good econ background, but the intuition is very simple. So the idea is for the government is to keep the value of the domestic currency strong so that Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, with a strong currency could buy international capital goods, not necessarily refrigerators or cars or bicycles. Now, the idea was to allow entrepreneurs to bring capital goods like machinery, equipment, because they understood that these imports of equipment and machinery was going to accelerate the transfer of technology. They understood, obviously, that they need to develop their own technology. Well, they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. They could bring some technology, either copy or mimic or use it to develop their own. Anyway, that was the other one, to maintain an overvalue exchange rate, import licenses, industrial incentives. There were subsidies or tax incentives in the form of reduced tax to investment, reduced tax to corporate profits, all these ideas to promote business, to promote enterprises, to promote the creation and development of this business class. Obviously, they also had a very important role for the government, right? And of course, like I said, it was not just policy making. We will see later that in many countries, this idea just went totally out of control. But federal governments start identifying, wait a second, I think I have something in the chat. All right, I'll answer to your question later, Dylan. Let me finish this talk. So the government in some countries took these ideas too far, as we will discover later, but let me give you some intuition first. So the idea was that the federal government was going to be the main investor in those key industries that were considered strategic for development, like infrastructure for transportation or infrastructure for energy, things like that, that in any country are of even national security level, right? No problem, especially because those industries require a massive amount of capital that even the richest folks in the country couldn't, face. But the problem was that in many governments, they start deviating from these strategic sectors. And then in many cases, governments became big and big and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. They start buying companies and industries that were not strategic. And I'll give you stories later of some cases in Mexico where, for example, the federal government was the owner of a candy factory. Like, where in the world can you classify candies as a matter of national security, right? Or in some cases, state governments were owners of bars and, discotheques and things like that. Okay, come on, give me a break, right? So we are going to engage in issues of corruption and mismanagement and abuse and all that in a few minutes. But anyway, originally that was the idea. Let me see, Dylan. With that, would it be possible to reduce private savings and affect domestic investment and capital stock in these countries? Okay, that's a good question. Let me see if I understand your question correctly, Dylan. Yes, there is something in macroeconomics that is called the crowding out effect. Crowding out effect. So in this context, what it means is that if the government grows too much and is starting to invest in this industry and in this industry and in this industry, the government is going to start taking spaces that would be more efficient for private entities to take over, right? Because, think about it. This is one of the, when it works well, one of the beauties of market activity that allows economic actors to direct resources in the most efficient way. But if the government is overtaking, literally taking spaces that should be open to private entities, well, things don't work. So the same way they overinvest, they can take over the role that domestic investors and domestic saving should be playing, right? So I don't know if I understood your question really well, but that's an important issue, the crowding out effect. You don't want to let the government get too big and too inefficient because, it comes at a cost. And as we will see in Latin America, the cost was huge. Mm-hmm.
Can one example be Cuba and right now Venezuela?
Hold on, I am listening somebody, but I don't see who is speaking and I couldn't understand. Can you please repeat?
It's me. Can one example be Cuba and Nicaragua?
Okay, Stephen. Well, Let me think here for a second. The case of Cuba is interesting or unique in that sense because, you know, Cuba, different from many other Latin American countries, has been facing the trade embargo, right? On the other hand, Cubans were receiving a huge amount of assistance from the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they start receiving assistance from Venezuela. And then that Venezuela collapsed, they are on their own. But now they are, anyway, Cuba is very particular. Nicaragua could be an interesting example of things going really, really, really bad when the government totally overtook the economy. Let's pause on that because remember, we're in this historical approach and we need to get through the ISI period, and then we need to get to the debt period in Latin America. And this is this is one of the darkest episodes in economic history in Latin America because that's the time when many countries got in the hole, in a dark hole that, you know, and they cannot get out even today in 2021 because many countries like Nicaragua have to pay debt, have to service the debt to private banks, multilateral agencies. So in some cases, get this, you know, 25% of whatever is produced within the country has to be used to pay back what was consumed in the 50s and the 60s, right? It's crazy. So hang in there, Stephen. It's a good question, but we're going to get there eventually. All right, very quickly, let's continue here. All right. So here you have a basic summary of the toolbox. State-owned enterprises. Originally, it's supposed to be for strategic sectors, and in some cases, like I explained, they just went crazy, you know, getting bars and candy factories and other business. Of course, there was a lot of partnerships, state and private, that's fine. In terms of international instruments, you know, tariffs, quotas, we talk about this. And here is another interesting one that I have not talked about, but this is basically what produced a massive amount of inflation and, well, eventually the fall of the ISI system. But, you know, the federal governments of these countries were receiving all this assistance, all this investment from international countries, banks, multilateral agencies. They were in full control of the economy, protected under this, you know, bubble, and they were running in these populist platforms. So many of these guys just went crazy, printing money, distributing money, spending money, appealing to the masses, very paternalistic approach. And that's how they maintain themselves in power. Sometimes in some countries, the possibility for re-election 2, 3, 4 times was possible. Sometimes in some countries like Mexico, for example, re-election is not possible, but you had political parties that were in power for 60 years, right? So it doesn't matter the name of the person, it's the group behind that is in control. So it doesn't matter. The point is that the abuse of the authority, corruption, protection, and this paternalistic approach was not very healthy. But of course, at the time, I mean, in hindsight, now it makes sense. Oh man, you shouldn't have done that and all that. But when you were there in the 60s and the 70s, even multilateral agencies, banks, were under the impression that this was a good business plan. And that's how they funnel the money. You know, you don't want to throw good money after bad money. In the minds of many bankers, international bankers, this was going to pay off. Actually, it did for them, but hold on. We're going to talk about that. Anyway, this is where I want to, one last page, all right? So what happened? Did it work? Well, let's see. In this table, you can see that, let me do this very quickly. Concentrate your attention in what happens here in the 1950s, 60s, and the 70s, you can see that GDP per capita was growing, in some cases very rapidly, like in Brazil at 6.1 in the 70s. Or, I don't know, you can pick another one, Panama, 4.8, Nicaragua, even 3.6, right? So a lot of these countries were growing faster. So in purely terms of economic growth, not development. Remember, we already make a distinction between growth, expanding the economy, and development, distributing the benefits of economic growth equally among the population. There is a difference. So in terms of economic growth, you can basically say that it was a clear success. Between 1950 and 1970, GDP in Latin America tripled. Huge, right? It was huge. Now, also let me bring your attention to this because this is going to be, what we are going to be exploring next week. Let me see if I can do this really quick. How do I do this? I guess this way. Yeah, I want to highlight this, the column of the 80s. You see the negative growth rates? So we are going to get, next week, we're going to get to the 1980s with the debt crisis in Latin America that began in Mexico in August of 1982. But right now, up to the late 1970s, everything was good in terms of economic growth. Clear all this. Import substitution was working because, yes, many industries were growing, were developing. Some countries, like I already mentioned, Brazil, were capable and able to develop their own industries, their own technology. A relatively qualified business class was born, and they were learning. At the same time, because of the heavy protectionism and the huge intervention of the state and populist governments, there is the birth and development of a very strong union labor movement, right? So many of these political parties in Chile, in Argentina, in Mexico, in Brazil, especially the large countries, require this organization of labor to support these populist governments. So it was in the best interest at the time of the government to facilitate the formation of all these unions and all these, trade teams and things like that. It was a very interesting time for Latin America. I was not born yet. I guess I was a little kid. But this was the time when, for example, my father was working for the government. And, we were not rich. My family comes from a very modest background. But at least I remember that all the way to the 1970s, at least what my mom and my dad used to tell me is that it was a period of relative peace, relative progress, more or less, equal distribution of things. The growth of middle class, things were going relatively well, right? So what went wrong? I am going to save these last 3 or 4 slides for the recorded version because, first of all, I ran out of time, but essentially, let me give you this quick advance story. These policies were unsustainable for many reasons that I'm going to explain in the class, in next class. But as a consequence of this collapse of the ISI strategy, we are going to look into the great opportunity for rich nations through the multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization to start coming back to Latin America. And this produced a very antagonic reaction in many cases, because like I said, we're going to talk about these conditions. They said, you guys are in a huge crisis. We can help you, but you have to change your model. Forget about populism. Forget about big governments. Forget about regulation. Forget about taxes. Forget about subsidies. Like, no, what are you talking about? Well, you need help or not, right? So this is going to be the beginning of the story that places multilateral agencies as villains in the story of economic development in Latin America. And of course, by association, puts the US and rich countries at the back seat of this strategy of new forms of exploitation, right? Which is a very interesting thesis that we are going to explore. Let me pause here in case you have questions or comments in the last 2, 3, 4 minutes that we have. Sandeep.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, when implementing the ISI strategy, that pretty much did it increase domestic prices for products? You would think the consumer price index would increase, right?
Yes, inflation.
Yes. And then did the government come in and like put price ceilings on certain products?
No. I mean, it didn't matter because they have a captive market. Yeah. Although the prices were going up, they could always increase the tariff even higher, so that there was no chance for domestic consumers to develop a preference for international markets because the prices with the tariff were prohibitive. So they had the advantage of keeping the market captive, and domestic consumers had no choice but to buy domestically at domestic prices.
Yeah.
Not a very good idea either, right? Yes, that's a good point. Yeah. Now, here's the other problem. And this is a kind of introduction to the next story. When you protect a child too much, they don't grow up properly, at least not in every case. They don't develop the social skills, communication skills. They are always behind dad, behind mom, behind the family. You know what I'm talking about? Well, something similar happened in Latin America. This protective bubble was overprotecting infant industries that they never developed. They didn't understand what international competition was about. They were not efficient because they didn't have to. If there was an increase in cost, well, just raise prices. No problem. The consumers have to buy from you. Well, that's not what business is supposed to be about, because if you do that in international markets, the market will kick you out in a heartbeat. Right? So this overprotective environment was abused. And we are going to see, once we compare this to what East Asian economies did, think about South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. They apply very similar policies to Latin America, but they understood that it was necessary to take the protection away at some point in order for these industries to really mature and compete and become efficient. In Latin America, they didn't do that. So they kept protecting and overprotecting and extending the protection because of the politics in Latin America, because of the corruption that play a major role, because of the, complacency, and because of the comfortable approach that many of these people in power were enjoying, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's an interesting part of the story. Anybody else? Dylan?
Long term, would that kind of contribute to did that maybe long term contribute to the income inequality, because you have like a relatively few wealthy company owners raising prices on domestic consumers who now have less and less money, disposable income?
Mm-hmm. Well, good point. Let me close with this. This is a very good point. So in the process of dismantling the ISI strategies, they have to engage in privatization. So they have to sell all these state-owned enterprises back to private hands, private investors, right? And this process in Latin America was so corrupt in many cases. So get this, how many of you don't have to raise your hand, but just think about it. How many of you have heard of this guy, Carlos Slim? He's like the 4th, 5th wealthiest person in Latin America. Well, guess what? He's Mexican. The 5th wealthy or 6th, don't quote me on this. We need to check the Fortune or the Forbes magazine, whatever. But this guy became very rich because he became the owner of the largest telecommunication company in Latin America. Boom. So this process of privatization increased income and wealth inequality even more. And we are going to explore that as well, Dylan. So the answer to your question is yes. Yes, it did. Right. Guys, I'm out of time. I'm going to stop recording. I will see you live on Wednesday again because Monday there is no class. So take a look at the lecture for Friday. No class Monday. We'll see each other live on Wednesday. Bye. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor.